Ellie was just a waitress, another face in the crowd, until Shaq saw the fear in her eyes. She wasn't just tired. She wasn't just struggling. She was hiding. Then came the black car. The man who grabbed her wrist, the way she flinched but didn't fight. Shaq had seen fear before, but this was different. This wasn't fear of losing a job or missing rent. This was fear of someone who had already lost everything. And Shaq? He wasn't about to look away. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and cheap bacon grease, the kind of place that never closed and never changed. The neon sign outside flickered weakly against the darkened street, casting a dull red glow onto the rain-slick pavement. Inside, the place was quiet, save for the occasional clatter of plates and the low hum of a radio playing an old blues song. Shaq sat in a corner booth, his tie loosened, fingers absently tracing the rim of his half-empty coffee cup. It had been a long day, a tense meeting, bad deals, too many people trying to sell him something he didn't need. He had stopped at this little hole-in-the-wall diner just to clear his head. Then he saw her. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with tired eyes and a nervous energy that made her seem smaller than she was. She moved quickly behind the counter, her hands wiping down tables with mechanical precision. But her mind was somewhere else. Her face was flushed, her eyes red, like she had been crying moments before stepping back into the fluorescent lights. Shaq wasn't the kind of man who pried into strangers' lives. But something about her felt off. It wasn't just exhaustion. It wasn't just a bad shift. She looked like someone trying to disappear. Shaq kept his eyes on her as he sipped his coffee. Then the manager walked out. A greasy-looking man in his late 40s, with a beer gut pressing against his too-tight button-up. His name tag read, Vince. He didn't look like the kind of boss who cared about his employees. "Ellie," Vince barked from behind the counter. "You forget how to move your damn feet? Table 3's been waiting 10 minutes. Ellie flinched but didn't argue. She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried off, her head down, shoulders tense. Shaq's jaw tightened. The place wasn't even that busy. There was no reason to yell. No reason to treat her like that. And yet, no one reacted. The cook at the grill didn't look up. The other waitress just kept taking orders, like this was normal. Like this was something they had all learned to ignore. When Ellie finally reached Shaq's table, she placed the check down quickly, avoiding eye contact. "Anything else?" she asked, her voice polite but flat, like she was on autopilot. Shaq glanced at her hands. They were shaking. He leaned back in his seat. "You okay?" She stiffened, not the way someone does when they're simply caught off guard. More like someone who had been asked that question before and knew better than to answer honestly. She forced a small, tired smile. "I'm fine. Just tired." Shaq wasn't convinced. "Sure about that?" Ellie's fingers curled slightly against her apron. "Yeah, just a long shift." Her voice was light, too light, but her eyes flicked toward the manager for just a second. A quick, unconscious movement. But Shaq caught it. Fear, not exhaustion, not stress. Fear. And that's when he knew. She wasn't just having a bad night. She was hiding something. And whatever it was, she was terrified. The night air was crisp, laced with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. The streets were quieter now, most of the late-night crowd having cleared out. Shaq leaned against his car across from the diner, arms crossed, his instincts buzzing with something he couldn't quite shake. Something about that waitress, Ellie, wasn't right. He had seen fear before, real fear. It wasn't exhaustion or stress that had made her hands shake. It was something worse. So instead of leaving, he stayed. Minutes passed. The lights inside flickered off one by one. The last customers had left, and now the staff trickled out, heading in different directions. Ellie was the last to step outside. She clutched her thin jacket tightly around herself, moving quickly, head down, as if trying to be invisible. Her pace wasn't just hurried, it was nervous, like she wanted to get as far away from here as possible. Shaq stayed in the shadows, watching. She turned the corner onto a dimly lit side street, and that's when it happened. A black car pulled up smoothly beside her. The kind of car that didn't belong in a rundown part of town like this. Sleek, expensive, deliberate. The door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, well-dressed, his dark suit fitting perfectly over a lean but strong frame. His posture was too controlled, too confident. Not just someone picking up a friend, someone who knew he had the upper hand. Ellie stopped cold. She didn't flinch, didn't back away. But Shaq saw it, the way her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, her shoulders locking. She knew this man, and she was afraid of him. Shaq shifted slightly, keeping his distance, watching. The man spoke, his voice too low for Shaq to hear, but the way Ellie's face changed told him everything. She nodded stiffly, her posture tense. She wasn't agreeing. She was obeying. Then, he grabbed her wrist. It was quick, forceful, not enough to cause a scene, but enough to send a clear message. Ellie tried to pull back, her lips parting slightly, but she didn't speak. She knew better than to fight. Shaq had seen enough. He stepped forward, his presence deliberate. The man released Ellie immediately. Slowly he turned, his cold, unreadable eyes locking onto Shaq. A silent assessment. A moment stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Shaq didn't need to say anything. His stance, the way he squared his shoulders, the way his eyes didn't waver, it all sent the same message. I see you. The man held his gaze for a second longer, then smirked. A slow, knowing expression. Then, without a word, he turned back toward the car, stepping inside as the door shut behind him. The vehicle pulled away, disappearing into the night. Ellie exhaled sharply, her breath shaking. Shaq turned to her. Who was that? She hesitated. Too long. Then, no one. Just a misunderstanding. She tried to leave, but Shaq caught her wrist, gently, unlike the man before. Ellie. His voice was low, steady. That wasn't a misunderstanding. She swallowed hard, but didn't look at him. I have to go, she whispered. And then she walked away, disappearing into the night. Shaq stood there, watching her go. He wasn't convinced. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a threat. The next morning, Shaq was back at the diner. Not because he needed breakfast, not because he even liked the coffee, because something about Ellie wasn't sitting right. He sat at the same booth, scanning the room while stirring a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The morning crowd was different. Truckers, nurses coming off night shifts, a couple of businessmen in wrinkled suits. But Ellie? She was the same. Moving quickly, keeping her head down, trying to disappear. But this time, Shaq wasn't just watching. He was looking. A customer walked in, a man in a leather jacket, tall, built, the kind of guy who carried weight in a room without saying a word. Ellie saw him. Her entire body stiffened. She turned sharply, disappearing into the back before he even reached the counter. Shaq's jaw tightened. She was running, even in plain sight. Minutes later, Ellie reappeared, carefully avoiding the man's gaze. She stayed in the farthest section of the diner, making herself small, moving with quiet precision. Then Shaq noticed something else. Her wrist. A bruise. Dark, fresh. Right where that man had grabbed her the night before. Shaq exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the coffee cup. This wasn't stressful. This wasn't a bad job. Ellie was in real trouble. That night, Shaq followed her. Not close enough to be obvious, but enough to see where she went when she left work. She didn't take the bus. She didn't head toward an apartment. She walked, fast, looking over her shoulder every few minutes. Shaq stayed a block behind, blending into the late-night foot traffic. Then she turned onto a side street and stepped inside a rundown motel. Shaq stopped, scanning the building. Flickering neon sign. Paint peeling off the walls. The kind of place you went to when you didn't want to be found. She was hiding. Shaq walked into the motel lobby, his presence immediately noticed by the guy behind the counter. Greasy hair, yellowed teeth. He didn't look like he cared about much, except money. Shaq pulled out a crisp $100 bill and set it on the counter. The girl who just came in, he said. What's her room number? The clerk hesitated, eyeing the cash. Then he took it. Room 212. Shaq nodded once and headed upstairs. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, his voice lower this time. Ellie, it's me. Silence. Then, a faint shuffle. The door creaked open just an inch. Ellie's face appeared, her eyes red, her expression guarded. You need to leave, she whispered. Shaq shook his head. Not until you tell me what's going on. Ellie hesitated. Then finally she stepped back, letting him in. The first thing Shaq saw? A suitcase. Packed. Ready to go. Ellie wasn't just hiding. She was running. The motel room was small, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. A single lamp flickered beside the bed, casting long shadows against the peeling wallpaper. The hum of a distant TV from another room buzzed faintly in the background, but inside this space, there was only silence. Shaq's eyes landed on the suitcase near the door. Packed. Ready. Ellie wasn't just hiding, she was running. She stood across the room, arms wrapped tightly around herself, shoulders hunched. She wouldn't look at him, her eyes fixed somewhere near the floor, like she was waiting for him to get angry, to tell her she was overreacting, that this wasn't his problem. But Shaq didn't move, didn't speak, just wait. Because he knew this look. The look of someone carrying too much for too long. The look of someone who wanted to disappear but couldn't. Ellie finally exhaled a shaky breath. You shouldn't have followed me. Shaq's voice was steady. You shouldn't be running alone. She let out a soft, humorless laugh, but there was no amusement in her eyes. What do you think you're gonna do, Shaq? Fix it? You don't even know what it is. Then tell me. She shook her head. You don't want to know. Shaq stepped forward, his gaze locked onto her. You've been afraid since the moment I met you. You flinch when people walk in the diner. You won't make eye contact with your manager. You lied to me about the guy who grabbed you last night. And now, you're here, with a bag packed, ready to disappear. His voice lowered. So tell me, Ellie, who the hell are you running from? Ellie swallowed hard. For a long moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, she broke. She sat down on the edge of the bed, pressing her palms against her thighs as if steadying herself. She took a slow breath, then another. And then, she said his name. Logan Pierce. Shaq didn't recognize it. But the way she said it, like she was afraid he could hear her even now, told him everything he needed to know. He's my ex, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. But not in the way you think. Shaq waited. He's not just some jealous guy who can't let go, she said, her fingers curling into fists. He's dangerous, powerful, connected to people who don't forgive debts or disobedience. Shaq's jaw tightened. At first, Ellie thought she could escape him. She moved to a new city, changed her number, stayed quiet. But Logan found her. He always found her. And when he did, he sent people to remind her. They don't hurt me, Ellie admitted, her voice hollow. Not yet. They just show up. Let me know they're watching. They whisper things when I walk past. They remind me that running is pointless, that I still belong to him. Shaq's fists clenched. Did you go to the police? Ellie let out a bitter laugh. Logan owns the police. Shaq exhaled slowly, his mind already working through possibilities. This wasn't just an abusive ex. This was a man who thought he was untouchable, and Shaq had dealt with men like that before. He knew exactly what to do. How bad is it? Shaq asked. Ellie hesitated. Bad. Details, Ellie. She pressed her lips together, shaking her head. You don't understand. Logan isn't just some rich guy who thinks he's above the law. He is the law. His family's been in this city for decades. They own businesses, politicians, cops, everything. That's why I never went to the police. Because even if they did take my statement, he'd know before I even walked out of the station. Shaq's face remained unreadable, but inside, he was already calculating. Ellie glanced at him. You should walk away, Shaq, before you get involved in something you can't fix. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. I won't walk away. Ellie looked at him for a long time. Then she sighed. Yeah, I figured. Shaq stood, crossing his arms. What's your plan? Ellie gestured toward the suitcase. Keep moving, keep running. Change my name again if I have to. Shaq shook his head. That's not a plan. That's survival, and survival only works until it doesn't. Ellie's jaw tightened. It's the only choice I have. No, Shaq said. It's the only choice he's convinced you that you have. Ellie exhaled sharply, frustrated. You don't get it, Shaq. Logan doesn't lose, ever. The moment you go up against him, you've already lost. Shaq stepped closer, his voice steady. Then maybe it's time someone changed that. Ellie stared at him, searching his face for something. Maybe doubt, maybe hesitation. But she didn't find any. And that scared her more than Logan did. Shaq. Her voice softened. This isn't your fight. He tilted his head. It is now. Ellie ran a hand through her hair, shaking her head. You're gonna get yourself killed. Shaq smirked. I don't die easy. She scoffed, but there was a hint of something else in her expression. Relief. Like for the first time, she wasn't in this alone. Shaq moved toward the door. Pack what you need, leave the rest. Ellie frowned. Where are we going? Shaq pulled out his phone, already dialing a number. To find out exactly what Logan Pierce doesn't want me to know. And with that, he walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. Ellie sat there for a long time. Then, slowly, she stood and zipped up her suitcase. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't running away. She was ready to fight back. Shaq wasn't a man who reacted to problems. He solved them. And this was a problem that needed to be handled. Ellie had spent the last 2 years running from Logan Pierce, convinced there was no way out. But Shaq knew better. Men like Logan, they thrived on fear. They didn't have real power, they had the illusion of it. And illusions? They could be shattered. Shaq sat across from Ellie in a quiet hotel room, the city lights flickering through the blinds. She looked exhausted, but there was something different in her posture now. For the first time, she wasn't just waiting for the next bad thing to happen. She was ready. Shaq leaned forward, his voice low and steady. You said Logan never loses, right? Ellie nodded slowly. Then we make sure this time, he does. She exhaled, rubbing her hands over her arms, as if trying to shake off the weight of fear that had been there for too long. How? Shaq placed his phone on the table. We give him what he wants. Ellie frowned. What does that mean? You, Shaq said simply. Ellie flinched, but Shaq shook his head. Not for real. But we make him believe you're giving in, that you're scared, that you're coming back to him. Ellie tensed. You want me to call him? Shaq nodded. Not just call him, meet him. Ellie's breath hitched, but Shaq held up a hand before she could protest. He won't touch you, Shaq promised. I'll be there. And more importantly, he tapped his phone. So will this. Ellie swallowed hard, understanding dawning in her eyes. You want him to incriminate himself? Exactly, Shaq said. We need proof that he's not just harassing you. We need him to admit to something that will bury him. Ellie let out a shaky breath, considering. And if he doesn't? Shaq's expression hardened. He will. Because men like Logan? They always got too comfortable. The next night, Ellie sent the text. Ellie, I can't do this anymore. I need to see you. The response came in seconds. Logan, I knew you'd come back. Ellie's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Her hands were shaking. Shaq placed his hand gently over hers, steadying it. You're not alone in this. Ellie nodded, took a deep breath, and typed. Ellie, meet me at the old railway station. Midnight. The dots appeared. Then, Logan, be there. Shaq exhaled slowly. The trap was set. Midnight. The railway station was abandoned. The tracks rusted, the air thick with the scent of damp metal and old concrete. A single street lamp flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows along the pavement. Shaq waited in the shadows, hidden but close. A small earpiece rested in his ear, connected to a recording device. Every word that was spoken tonight would be captured. Ellie stood alone in the open, arms wrapped around herself. She wasn't faking her fear. It was real. But this time she wasn't defenseless. Headlights cut through the darkness. A sleek black car rolled to a stop, the door opening slowly. Logan stepped out, tall, confident, draped in arrogance like a second skin. His dark suit was pressed to perfection, his smirk sharp as he approached Ellie. "You look like hell," he said, his tone smooth, condescending. Ellie flinched, casting her gaze downward. I just want to come back." Shaq listened, waiting. Logan tilted his head. "Do you?" Ellie hesitated. "Yes." A long silence stretched between them. Then, Logan chuckled. "Good girl," he murmured, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. Ellie forced herself not to recoil. Shaq's fingers tightened into fists. Then Logan's voice dropped lower, his tone dark, smug. "You really thought you could run from me?" he whispered. "That I'd let you?" Ellie swallowed. I made a mistake." Logan leaned in, his lips near her ear. "Damn right you did." Then, he laughed. "You should have seen them, Ellie. The ones who thought they could walk away. Do you know where they are now?" Ellie's breath hitched. Logan smirked. "Exactly." Shaq's heart pounded. That was it. Logan wasn't just threatening her. He was admitting to something bigger. And every single word was being recorded. Shaq moved. "That's enough." His voice cut through the night like a blade. Logan froze. Slowly, he turned. His smirk faded as he took in Shaq's broad frame stepping out of the shadows. "The hell is this?" Logan muttered, his eyes narrowing. Shaq stepped forward, his voice calm, measured. "You should be more careful about what you say, Pierce." Logan's jaw ticked. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Shaq smirked. "Actually, I do. And so will the rest of the city when this hits the news." He lifted his phone, screen glowing with the live recording. Logan's face paled. For the first time, the overconfidence cracked. "You son of a..." "You were right about one thing," Shaq interrupted smoothly. "You don't lose, because you never had to." His voice dropped lower, deadlier. "Until now." Logan stepped back. He wasn't running the show anymore. He was trapped. Logan Pierce caught on tape. Threats, cover-ups, and the men who disappeared. Then came the fallout. Lawyers, investigators, government officials trying to distance themselves. Logan wasn't untouchable anymore. And Ellie? She wasn't his anymore. She was free. Logan Pierce had built his world on control, money, and fear. For years he moved in the shadows, pulling strings, making problems disappear before they ever became real threats. But now, everyone was watching. Shaq had waited until the right moment. The recording wasn't just leaked, it was strategically placed, sent to a journalist who wasn't afraid to expose the powerful. A man who had spent years trying to pull back the curtain on people like Logan, but had never had undeniable proof. Until now. The headline hit first. Logan Pierce caught on tape. Threats, cover-ups, and the men who disappeared. Then came the news segment, playing Logan's own words for the world to hear. His threats, his arrogance, his admissions. The fallout was instant. Business associates scrambled to distance themselves. Lawyers rushed to contain the damage. Even the police officials on his payroll had to choose, risk sinking with him or let him drown alone. And Logan? He was out of moves. But cornered animals were dangerous. Logan wasn't the type to accept defeat. He wasn't going to let some recording destroy the empire he'd built. So he did the only thing left to do. He sent men after Ellie. They came at night. 2 black SUVs, engines rumbling low like predators waiting to strike. 4 men stepped out, professional, cold, efficient. They thought it would be easy. They thought Ellie was alone. They were wrong. Shaq was waiting. The confrontation wasn't loud. No guns, no screaming. Just Shaq, standing in front of Ellie, blocking the doorway of the safe house he had moved her to. His stance was relaxed, but his presence, unshakable. The men hesitated. They knew who he was. More importantly, they knew what had happened to Logan. Shaq's voice was calm, steady. "Go back to your boss. Tell him it's over." One of the men scoffed. You think a recording is gonna stop him? Shaq smirked, tilting his head. I think his bank accounts being frozen might. A pause. A flicker of uncertainty. Shaq pulled out his phone, scrolling casually before turning the screen toward them. A live feed. Breaking news. Multiple accounts linked to Logan Pierce under federal investigation. Shaq took a slow step forward. Money and fear only work when no one is watching. But now, he smiled. Everyone is watching. The men exchanged glances. They had come to make a point, but suddenly they weren't so sure they were on the right side of this. One of them muttered something under his breath. Then, without another word, they turned back to their SUVs. Engines rumbled. And then, they were gone. Ellie, standing behind Shaq, let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time in years, no one was chasing her. She was finally free. Logan knew it was over before the phone call came. He was sitting in his office, staring at the TV screen, watching his life fall apart in real time. Bank accounts frozen, property seized, associates publicly denying any ties to him. Then the call came. One of his closest allies. A man who had always had his back. I can't help you. Logan gripped the phone tighter. You owe me. A pause. Then, not anymore. The line went dead. Logan exhaled shakily, setting the phone down with too much control. His hands clenched into fists. He had spent years making sure everyone owed him something. Now, when did he needed them most? They were all gone. The next morning, Logan stepped outside his penthouse, expecting his driver to be waiting. Instead, 2 federal agents were standing by a black sedan. Logan Pierce? He didn't answer. Didn't need to. You're under investigation for multiple criminal offenses. We have a few questions. Logan forced a smirk, straightening his suit. You don't have anything on me. One of the agents lifted a folder. We have enough. Logan's smirk faltered, because he knew. This time he wasn't walking away. Back at the safe house, Ellie stood by the window, watching the sun rise over the city. She wasn't looking over her shoulder anymore. She wasn't waiting for the next threat. She was free. Shaq, leaning against the doorway, sipped his coffee. You okay? Ellie turned, a small, real smile forming. Yeah, I think I am. And for the first time, she meant it. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting warm hues over the city skyline. The air smelled different, cleaner, lighter. Maybe it was the crisp morning breeze, or maybe it was something else. Something that had nothing to do with the world outside and everything to do with the weight Ellie no longer carried. For the first time in years, she wasn't waking up in fear. No more jumping in the shadows. No more looking over her shoulder. No more waiting for the inevitable knock at the door. Because the empire he had built on fear, money, and control had crumbled under the weight of the truth. His bank accounts were frozen. His allies had abandoned him. And now he was facing a future where he was the one locked in a cage. And Ellie? She was finally free. Shaq watched her from across the room, arms crossed, a satisfied but subtle smile tugging at the corner of his lips. She looked different. Not in the way she dressed. She still wore simple jeans and a t-shirt, still had her hair pulled up in a loose ponytail. But in the way she stood. For the first time, Ellie wasn't shrinking into herself. She wasn't hiding. Shaq took a slow sip of his coffee, nodding slightly. So, what's next? Ellie glanced at him, then back out the window, as if taking in the world for the first time. I don't know, she admitted. I never thought this far ahead. Shaq chuckled. Freedom's funny like that. Once you have it, you realize you never planned for it. Ellie exhaled, rubbing her palms against her thighs. Yeah, it's weird. Good. But weird. Shaq leaned back, studying her. You don't have to figure it all out today. But you should know. You've got options now. She glanced at him. Like what? Shaq set his coffee down, tilting his head. Well, for starters, you don't have to stay in this city. If you want a fresh start, I can help. Ellie shook her head. I'm done running. Shaq smiled. Good answer. Over the next few weeks, Ellie rebuilt. She moved out of the motel and into a small but comfortable apartment. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with old wooden floors and a slightly leaky faucet. But it was hers. No more borrowed spaces. No more feeling like a guest in her own life. She got a new job, not out of necessity, but because she chose it. She had spent so long feeling trapped in the diner, tied to a routine that kept her head down and her feet moving just to survive. But now she walked into work because she wanted to, and it wasn't just about the job. It was about who she was becoming. She stood taller, she spoke with confidence, she laughed more, and she wasn't afraid anymore. One afternoon, she found herself standing outside the diner where this all began. The place looked the same. Greasy windows, flickering neon sign, the faint smell of burnt coffee, and old grease wafting out onto the street. But it felt different. She wasn't the same girl who had once wiped her tears behind the counter, pretending nothing was wrong. She stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. The staff barely looked up, just another customer. She smiled. That's all she had ever wanted, to just exist without fear. She took a seat in the same booth she had once served Shaq from. And now, he was the one sitting across from her. Shaq smirked. Full circle moment, huh? Ellie chuckled, shaking her head. Yeah. Feels weird being on this side of the table. Shaq lifted his coffee. To new beginnings? Ellie grinned, clinking her water glass against his. To new beginnings. For the first time in years, she wasn't running. She was home. Ellie's story isn't just about survival. It's about taking back control. She spent years trapped in fear, believing there was no way out. But the moment she stopped running and fought back, everything changed. How many people are out there, hiding from their own battles? How many believe they're powerless against those who hold control over them? This story is proof. Power is an illusion, and fear only lasts as long as you let it. Watch till the end, because sometimes the only way to escape the past is to finally face it.